Hi, pastors. I trust you're enjoying your time of fellowship today. Would love to be there and hear you sing and to be able to pray with you one of these days soon. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the book of Second Kings. So if you have your Bibles, would love to see you turn there as we see what started as a strong nation becomes divided and then ultimately ends up in exile. When we think about where we are in the big story of the scriptures, the book of Second Kings begins with a divided kingdom, the kingdom that divided immediately after Solomon. We have moments of hope, just like we did in First Kings, when we have revival kings like Jehoshaphat, Joash, and others. But the book ultimately ends in a downward spiral in exile. Actually, two exiles, first for the northern kingdom and then for the second kingdom. So this book ends very much like the book of Judges does. As everyone did what was right in their own eyes, God judges them for that, and there are no leaders to bring them out as the kings all ultimately fail. When we think about the book of Second Kings, a good theme statement would be a divided kingdom falls into exile. Just stop and think about 1 Samuel, a king with no heart, Saul. 2 Samuel, a king whose heart was fully devoted to the Lord, in David. 1 Kings, a king who was partially devoted to the Lord, in Solomon. And now that divided heart of Solomon produced a divided kingdom, and that divided kingdom spirals downward until the nation ends up in exile. What we're going to notice with the book of Second Kings is the kings are of mixed character, some good, some bad. I mentioned in our last session the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Remember, if we were to picture them, we'll take this off for a second. If we were to picture the kings of the north, the northern kingdom, those who followed Jeroboam, every single king was evil. So each king took them deeper and deeper down until there was exile. In the nation of Judah in the south, which had Jerusalem as its capital, still had the temple, you would have evil kings and then you would have godly kings. Evil kings, godly kings. So it's a bit of an up and down as it works its way down ultimately to exile later. So when we open up the book of Second Kings, we begin with the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. It's important in this time in which the kings are mixed, sometimes reliable, sometimes not, that the ministries of the prophets are always reliable. If we were to go through and make observations about every time a prophet spoke in 1st and 2nd Kings, somewhere in 1st and 2nd Kings, we would see the fulfillment of that. Every word that the prophets spoke for God came true. So Elijah and Elisha and the prophets that follow them, they serve as a great contrast to the kings who sometimes can be trusted and sometimes not. But the word from the man of God, the prophet, could always, always be trusted. We also learn from this story, these chapters of Elijah and Elisha, I just want to remind you of the importance of mentoring. Remember, before we started this program together, the expectation for each of you was that you were mentoring people, you were training leaders. That is the biblical pattern. Think of how long Moses trained up Joshua, who went on to replace him, how often and how long Elisha followed Elijah and worked with him, and then Elisha took his place. we are mentoring leaders, raising up leaders who are going to fill our spaces and others. So just an encouragement as you think about your mentoring to do it intentionally and take seriously the work that you spend in training your leaders, following the example of Elijah training up Elisha. This is also when we see the transition between Elijah and Elisha. You'll notice that when Elisha picks up the mantle left behind from Elijah, that Elisha prays that God would give him a double portion of the spirit that was on Elijah. How's that for a bold prayer? He'd seen all that Elijah had done, and he asked God that he would have a double portion of that spirit that worked through Elijah. If we went through and listed all the miracles that Elijah did in the power of the Lord, and then came to Elijah and listed all the miracles that Elisha did in the name of the Lord, you know what we would discover? Elisha does twice as many miracles as Elijah. His fervent, bold prayer to the Lord was answered as that double spirit went from Elijah to Elisha, and he did twice as many miracles as his mentor Elijah had done. Now, when we take a look at the next two sections of the book, we're going to see a history of kings that lead us, first of all, to the fall of Samaria. Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. Samaria represents the country that had followed Jeroboam and had decided to worship the golden calves at Dan and Bethel. And we see, leading up to chapter 17, the history that brings us to the final exile. And then with the fall of Samaria, we see the northern kingdom. Their capital is destroyed, and they are carried away by the nation of Assyria. Now we'll come back and compare these. But then once the northern kingdom is gone, all of the kings that we see, of course, are in the south. And so for the next 6 chapters, we see a history of the kings of the south, and they also take that downward slide that lead to the fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem comes at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and the nation of Babylon. Think about how God was faithful to his promise to David, even in the 2 falls. In the fall of Samaria, when the northern kingdom is taken into captivity, they're taken into captivity by the Assyrians. The Assyrians believe the way to maintain world power is to take their captives and disperse them all over the world, and then to import other people that they've captured and bring them into the nation. The idea is to so mix the races that there only is one pure race, and that's the Assyrians. And so with that, we hear very little of the northern kingdom. There are very few people left that are preserved. And you'll notice the name Samaria. This mixed race is where the Samaritans of the New Testament come from. That group of people that the Jews hated because the Samaritans represented the mixed race of their enemies. Now, in God's grace and his keeping his promise to David, when Babylon captured the southern kingdom, Babylon did not believe in dispersing its captives. Instead, it carried them off and allowed them to live in their own villages and their own communities, protected. So even though they were carried away captive and even though they were prisoners, God in his grace protected the southern kingdom and protected the line of David, the line of Christ, by bringing them to Babylon, where they would be able to be protected and shielded, and one day would be able to return to the land. Let's talk about some important questions from 2 Kings. Discuss the rise of the prophet. We see Nathan in 2 Samuel 12, and then Elijah and Elisha. What was their relationship to the kings? And what do we learn from that? What do we do as ministers and as prophets, as voices for God in our culture, in our churches today? What was their relationship? So I'd like you to take a look at the times that the prophets and the kings interacted. How did how did they call the kings to righteousness? And second, this one will take a little bit longer. What leadership lessons can we learn from the kings who brought revivals? What I would like you to do is to divide into groups and assemble a list. Who were the kings who brought revivals? Now, I've given you a few names: Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Joash, Josiah. But I would like you to go through your Bibles and create the list. Who were the ones that brought the people back to the Lord? And then I would like you to divide into groups, and each group take one of those kings and study. How did God use them? What did they do that helped brought the nation back to the Lord? And then from that, create this list of leadership lessons, this list of principles of how God's leaders can bring people back to true worship. This could be a helpful list for us as we think about our own ministries and the role that we play in bringing back people back to the Lord and back to true worship and back to true devotion to Him. So I look forward to hearing from Freddie how you did on those lists and some of the lessons that you've learned. And I hope you have a great discussion, a very encouraging and productive discussion as you think about how does God use leaders to bring His people back to Him.